Good afternoon. I'm Paul DiRienzo, host of The Torch.
More than 40 people have been indicted in the scheme that allegedly involved students gaining entrance to schools including Georgetown, Stanford, Wake Forest University, UCLA, and Yale as recruited athletes, regardless of their athletic ability, or on inflated college entrance exam test scores. Some deep-pocketed parents paid as much as $6.5 million, while most plunked down between $250,000 and $400,000. Author, teacher, and advocate Jonathan Kozol is famous for his books blasting American education with titles like Death at an Early Age, Shame of a Nation, and Savage Inequalities. Kozol says he's not surprised by the scandal, which is the outcome of an educational system that stifles the poor while grooming the rich for power and achievement.
It's rigged to start with in favor of the powerful, the wealthy, the orchestrating classes. It may be a crime in terms of defrauding the government of taxes, but the real crime is that every time one of these privileged students is able to buy their way into a prestigious university, they're stealing that seat from another child who may be very poor, maybe black, maybe Latino, for whatever reason, they're stealing that seat from a child who deserves it more than they do. We're never going to have anything like an honest meritocracy in the United States so long as this continues. And, you can condemn, and you ought to condemn the agencies that perpetrate these frauds and act as intermediaries for the families. But the ultimate blame lies in the colleges and universities themselves. There's no way that the deans at these colleges could be totally unaware that this is going on. One larger point, it's not simply this handful of people who've been able to buy their way into colleges. We've had legacy admissions for decades, for a century, at all these prestigious universities. So students whose families attended the same university for 3 generations, or students whose families have just built a spectacular new library, new science center for the college. They have an easy road. They just, unless they're totally incompetent, they walk right in. It's part of the entire panorama of gross inequality, which betrays and it betrays anything resembling democracy in the United States.
What is exactly the benefit of some of these colleges? I know they're great colleges, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, all of them. Yet there was a time I went to the University of Wisconsin. It was $250 a semester in state, and I got a first-rate education, second to none. And it was ranked above Harvard in political science and other. What exactly are people getting for all that money?
When parents spend as much as $50,000 or more to put their children into the most prestigious colleges in the United States, they may not be getting a better education than they could have gotten at a really good state university, like the University of Massachusetts in Amherst or University of Michigan or Wisconsin. But that's not the point. They're getting connections. They're entering a social milieu in which, the guy who lives across the hall or the who's in the next room on the same dormitory has parents who are going to introduce these young people into a world of opportunities, networks, job opportunities at the highest levels of Wall Street, for example. That's the ultimate prize that they're getting.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that the problem right there, that there's such a multi-tiered educational system where depending on what school you get into, not your education, not the level of teaching that you're exposed to, judges what you can do and how high you can rise in our society?
Absolutely. It's rigged from the beginning, and it doesn't simply start when the student enters an Ivy League college. It begins much sooner. It begins when their parents are able to guarantee that they can go to a very expensive private school or a public school in a very highly funded suburban school district, which has 12 AP classes and super sophisticated science and computer labs and 2 foreign languages, and the students learn French, learn to speak with an elegant French accent by the time they're in the 12th grade. While poor kids are getting half as much money invested in their public educations, and I've written books about this.
I read your books are required reading in many of the courses at City College where I got my master's degree. So I'm familiar with your work, and when I go and teach in some of these very poor districts in the South Bronx, where I have taught in Hunts Point and places like that, and I wonder, what is it? The teachers are often very dedicated. It's not that there's lack of dedication. Often we do have stuff. We have computers and things like that, and we have libraries, but they seem unused, strangely unused is the word I would say. What is really going on that distinguishes a better education within a school system like the New York City school system, and if you're lucky enough to go to one school district rather than another?
The savage inequalities that I've been describing through the years are not simply measurable in terms of physical resources. Sometimes I'll come into a very poor inner city school, and on the surface, it looks as though they have rough equivalency with a super wealthy suburban school. Physical differences are extreme in many cases. In the case of cities like Pittsburgh and Baltimore, for example, where lead poison is infesting the schools, and children can't drink the water without potential damage to their cognitive abilities. But the deeper difference, I believe, is in the nature of curriculum. In the better schools in the United States, and I mean wealthier schools in wealthier districts where parents have voices that can be heard, there's a broad range of cultural opportunities for students. It's not simply teach to the test. It's not simply drill and kill, and it's not simply a narrowed curriculum that conforms with a certain set of state demands. But again and again in inner city schools and in poor rural schools I've visited, the curriculum is, no matter what they say on paper, the curriculum in effect is narrowed down to a sparse and bleak agenda, which is restricted to items that are most easily measured on a standardized exam. So they're getting essentially a stripped-down, business-driven education, which trains them for marginal success at the bottom levels of the economic order, while wealthy kids are empowered to inherit the earth.
What happened to college? College changed from sort of like a thing that you went to because you felt like it added a few things. High school was good enough. All of a sudden now you have to go to college and it's outrageously expensive. It was never like that. What happened? What changed?
For most of the jobs that are going to be available and important and essential in 10 years, 20 years from now, high school education is not going to be sufficient. That's one really hard, realistic economic point. The virtue of higher education is that it opens up a student's mind to infinite possibilities. It doesn't simply say, okay, you're 15 years old, so you're going to settle for automotive training, an area where you probably won't need human beings 10 years from now because of artificial intelligence and so forth. In the course of a true liberal arts education in college, a student learns the kinds of skills that open up apertures into an infinite number of possible economic careers. And beyond that, it opens up the possibility that they may not want to go into any kind of commercial acquisitional career. They might want to become a poet or an artist or just a marvelous social maverick who ends up as an activist and change agent in our society. All that is foreclosed to students who get essentially a terminal utilitarian education in those kinds of high school programs that are now aimed exclusively at what I call utility to the corporate society.
Okay, and let me. I want to end on a hopeful note. Is there any hope on the horizon, or anything you see that could change this?
I can see two big changes. I don't know if I'll live to see this happen, but at one level, there's a rising tide of real outrage in this country, among young people at least, at the fact that we still have essentially a dual school system, talking about K-12 education, that, we still have a system that is wildly segregated and viciously unequal. There are pilot programs around the country. There's one in the metropolitan Boston area, which have had tremendous success in bringing races and classes together in voluntary integration programs. And there's going to be a major conference at Rutgers in May, organized by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, to address this issue. That's one hopeful sign. The bigger one is the one that people like AOC and Bernie Sanders have been advancing, and that's the idea that all university and college education ought to be free. Now, they'll never be able to enforce that at private colleges like Yale or Princeton, but certainly for public universities. That's not only a very good idea, but it's one that I think we're within reach of obtaining. I think we might get to that point within another 5 years.
Back to the days when City College was free, basically, in a place like
that. Yeah, and that's one big breakthrough that seems eminently possible. And that's why I've just been cheering for young political leaders like Ocasio-Cortez to push that aggressively and not give up on that, because that would be a big first step towards getting the United States at least a couple of inches closer to being a genuine democracy.
Tell me a little bit, just a minute or two, about your life. What led you to a life dedicated to education?
I was a Harvard student and then a Rhodes Scholar, and I also had to go back to Harvard and become an English professor when I heard that 3 young people, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, had been murdered in Mississippi by the Ku Klux Klan, and that event changed my life. I just got in my little car and turned my back on Harvard Square and went to Roxbury, the black community of Boston, became a teacher. And one way or another, I've stuck with that ever since, either teaching children or hanging out in classrooms and trying to empower their teachers to resist the terrible pressure to force children to conform to a corporate uniformity, and trying to encourage teachers to resist the testing mania that's been foisted on our public schools. And it's been a joyful life, joyful struggle. And I always tell young people, don't think that social justice is all grim and sad and sweaty. It is pretty sweaty because you have to work hard. But there's also kind of a joy and jubilation in the sense that you're a part of history.
Mm-hmm. What are your books, just your important books on education?
Death at an Early Age. My first book described segregation in the Boston schools, won the National Book Award in 1968. Savage Inequalities, 1991. I'd say the third most influential book was probably The Shame of the Nation, which was published about 10 years ago. And that's about the profound inequality and segregation in the New York City public schools.
The most segregated school system in the United States?
Yeah, and in the nation as a whole. But I tend to draw my books from from my immersion in a single neighborhood and district. And I'd spent about 10 years in the schools and homes of people in the South Bronx, in Mott Haven. That's where a lot of my beliefs have generated. And that's where the stories that I tell originate.
Some of those schools, I felt like I was in jail when I worked there. That students were in jail. It wasn't really a school. It was a prison.
You were at Hunts Point.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, the teachers were good and everything, and they tried, but you always got this feeling of hyper, fear of the students getting out of control all the time. And
absolutely. The teachers are good. I mean, I meet terrific teachers everywhere I go. And the scapegoating of teachers favorite preoccupation of dumb politicians and right-wing think tanks. There are plenty of marvelous teachers in these schools, but they're under the sword. You know, if you don't pump those test scores 2.3 percentage points this year, that's proof that you're a failure, and we'll either toss you out or close the school and hand it over to one of these miserable charter schools instead.
I see. So you don't think charter schools are a good idea?
No, I think that charter schools have been a calamity for the United States. Charter schools are simply a sweetened version of the old voucher scheme that right-wing families like the Waltons and right-wing economists like Milton Friedman were trying to sell to America in the 1950s and 60s. Charter schools are, by the way, by far the most segregated schools in America, and not by accident, but by intention, because they target their curriculum specifically at techniques which they tell us are specifically appropriate to races and classes that are treated as subordinate in the United States. I mean, you set up a school called African American Academy of Enterprise, and you're not going to get too many white kids lining up for enrollment. This is an attempt by the right wing in America to do an end run around Brown versus Board of Education.
When they call the schools these fancy names, what they're really doing is segregating them by name, using the names.
Yeah, they're great at coming up with marketing phrases to describe them. So, you know, they're all in favor of achievement, excellence, power, entrepreneurial abilities. But in fact, they are the ultimate examples of autocratic institutions that manufacture the consent of the next generation of young black and other minority adults in American society. They're very dangerous. And, you can always find, they're very good at putting on a show. So they'll invite reporters to the most successful charter school in a particular town, and the journalists are impressed. Looks good on a one-time visit. But they have no idea that what they're doing essentially is constructing a parallel agenda, totally different from the one that would be acceptable in any good public school in a town like Manhasset, Great Neck, or my own hometown of Newton, Massachusetts, where progressive values still are highly valued. So we're training one generation for what I call minimal utility and obedience, and we're educating the other generation to inherit the power of their parents.
Great. Last question, what are you working on? Anything you're working on now? What do we look out for?
I have a new book that's in the works. It's about three-quarters done, but I'm superstitious. I never say what a book's about till I see it in print.
All right, I'll let you go on that. Thank you very much.
I'm 82 years old, and I'm still in the struggle.
Education activist Jonathan Kozol is author of numerous books on education, including Death at an Early Age, Shame of a Nation, and Savage Inequalities.
In other major headlines of the day, Boeing's troubles continued, with the United States joining the rest of the world in grounding all Boeing 737, MAX 8, and MAX 9 planes. The action came via executive order issued by President Trump on Wednesday afternoon. The U.S. was the last remaining nation to keep flying the jet model, which is under scrutiny after its second deadly plane crash in 5 months. The October 29, 2018 crash in Indonesia killed 189 people, while the latest crash in Ethiopia killed 157 people. Here's what Trump had to say.
New information and physical evidence that we've received from the site and from other locations and through a couple of other complaints. We've had a very, very detailed group of people working on the 737-8 and the 737-9 new airplanes. We're going to be issuing an emergency order of prohibition to ground all flights of the 737 MAX 8 and the 737 MAX 9 and planes associated with that line. I've spoken to Elaine Chao, Secretary of Transportation, Dan Elwell, Acting Administrator of the FAA, and to Dennis Muhlenberg, CEO of Boeing, and they'll be available shortly after our conference today. They are all in agreement with the action. Any plane currently in the air will go to its destination and thereafter be grounded until further notice. So planes that are in the air will be grounded. If they're the 737 MAX, will be grounded upon landing at the destination. Pilots have been notified. Airlines have been all notified. Airlines are agreeing with this. The safety of the American people and all people is our paramount concern. Our hearts go out to all of those who lost loved ones, to their friends, to their families in both the Ethiopian and the Lion Airlines crashes that involved the 737 MAX aircraft. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Boeing is an incredible company. They are working very, very hard right now. And hopefully they'll very quickly come up with the answer. But until they do, the planes are grounded.
The Federal Aviation Administration had spent much of the week defending their decision to keep flying the 737 MAX 8 model, saying it didn't have any data to show the jets were unsafe. U.S. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao and her staff even flew on one of the planes to show their faith in them. However, after Trump's order, they stated that new evidence collected at the site, together with newly refined satellite data available to the FAA this morning, led to the decision. Boeing is the second largest defense contractor in the world. Its former CEO is currently Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick M. Shanahan, who is being probed for using his office to win contracts for Boeing. In September 2018, the company received $13.7 billion in Pentagon contracts to build drone tankers, U.S. Air Force training jets, helicopters, and more. Bill Hartung is an analyst with the Center for International Policy. He says Boeing has always had close connections to the government, a relationship that's constantly growing.
I think that could have been a factor. I mean, they didn't wait weeks and weeks, but they were the last to kind of wake up to the problem. So, a powerful U.S. company with ties to the administration, I think that certainly could be part of it.
Tell us a little bit about this company, Boeing. Its planes are iconic all over the world. They're considered the Cadillac of planes in a lot of ways. What is the role of Boeing in the United States?
The thing that a lot of people don't think about is, although Boeing makes airliners, they're also the second largest weapons contractor in the country. And actually, a former Boeing executive, Patrick Shanahan, is now the Secretary of Defense. So they get about $20 billion a year or more in Pentagon contracts, year in and year out. They make some of the bombs that are being used in Yemen. They make fighter aircraft that have been sold to Saudi Arabia and other countries. They make attack helicopters. They're involved in making transport aircraft. So there's a whole range of things they do for the Pentagon. And now Patrick Shanahan has actually inserted a Boeing aircraft into the budget that the Air Force didn't even want. So there's a lot of influence peddling on behalf of this company in this administration.
The Secretary of Defense, he's acting right now, and the president, just the other day, it was the president or his spokesperson was praising this guy to the hilt, but they have yet to really make him the full Secretary of Defense, and yet he's picking planes to be purchased by the military from his own former company? Yes.
There's a version of the F-15, which is a prior generation aircraft called the F-15X. And he's been pushing it since he's been Secretary of Defense. The former Secretary of the Air Force, who just left, Heather Wilson, said, we don't want this plane, we don't need this plane. Shanahan was criticizing Lockheed Martin, Boeing's main rival, which means the F-35, which is the sort of plane of this current generation. So basically he's cutting the Lockheed Martin plane, he's sliding in the Boeing planes, and he's doing it, as far as we can tell, against the which is the Air Force. And in fact, there's an organization called the CRUISE. It's for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and they are filing an ethics complaint against Patrick Shanahan for this maneuver on behalf of the Boeing plane.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of this company?
They've always had strong representation in Congress. So Henry Jackson, who was a very powerful conservative senator, would always go to bat for Boeing, whether it had to do with their commercial side or the military side of their business. And Washington State and the Seattle area were kind of the hub of Boeing's activities. There was a representative, Norm Dix, also from out there, who sort of played the counterpart role to Henry Jackson, but in the House. He was on the Appropriations Committee, and he was always inserting money for Boeing into the budget. It's shifted a bit now because they've moved a lot of their military operations out of Seattle. So they have a big factory in the St. Louis area that makes combat aircraft. They have big facilities in Southern California, including their top-secret research facility, rather. I mean, we know the facility exists, but a facility that does top-secret research. So they have a long history of kind of using Congress to do their bidding, often with the members who are in the districts where they have factories, where they create jobs using our tax dollars.
Yeah, do we have any knowledge of the roots of that, where it comes from, that close relationship? Was it in the birth of the company, the people who founded it? Or
it came early on. I think it was solidified in the 90s when they bought McDonnell Douglas, which was at that time one of the major contractors and the builder of a lot of the nation's fighter aircraft. So that just pushed them up a level in terms of their Pentagon contracts, their facilities around the country, the kind of money they could spend on lobbying and campaign contributions. So they, they shifted, I would say, in the 90s even further towards the military side of the business.
Bill Hartung is analyst with the Center for International Policy. Pakistan's military said on Friday that it wasn't preparing for war after last week's deadly attack in the disputed provinces of Jammu and Kashmir. On February 14th, 40 Indian police officers were killed in a suicide bombing carried out by a Pakistan-based terrorist group. The attack sparked massive protests in India against Pakistan and refocused attention on the two nuclear-armed enemies. American University history professor Peter Kuznick, who heads the school's Nuclear Studies Institute, says India is stoking the flames that are being lit by Pakistan.
Last week, there was an important terrorist incident in Kashmir in which Pakistani-linked terrorists exploded a bomb that killed at least 40 Indian soldiers. This is a crisis that's been ongoing for decades. In fact, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars since independence in 1947. 2 of the wars have been over Kashmir. The situation there has not been resolved. You've got a largely Muslim population that has been bristling under Indian control. The United Nations has called upon India to allow a referendum in that area, and India has refused to do so. And so this has always been a hotbed. The terrorists in that region have been closely tied to the ISI, to Pakistani intelligence. And so we've had quite a few situations there that have gone close to war. There have been 2 or 3 major terrorist attacks by Pakistani-linked terrorists in India. In 2001, there was the attack on the Indian Parliament, and then in 2008, there was the terrorist attack in Mumbai, in which they went after the luxury hotels, the train station, the Jewish center, and 166 Indians were killed there. After the 2001 terrorist incident, both sides mobilized more than 1 million troops, and the world quaked at the prospect of India and Pakistan going to war at that point. Both countries had just tested their nuclear weapons in 1998. So the scenario that most people predicted was that the Indian army would overwhelm the Pakistani army. Pakistan would retaliate with tactical nuclear weapons. India would respond with its nuclear weapons, and we'd have a full-scale nuclear war. That seemed almost likely at that point. And you had cavalier statements by military leaders on both sides. The leading Pakistani general said, well, you can get killed crossing the street, getting hit by a car, or you can get killed in a nuclear war. What's the difference? So with that kind of thinking, that heightened our concern over the danger at that point. There was another incident in 2016 in which 19 were killed, and now this incident in which 40 Indian troops were killed, and there have been a couple other smaller terrorist incidents surrounding that. What's happening in India is Prime Minister Modi, who's a conservative Buddhist, Hindu nationalist with the BJP party, is up for re-election in May. And it looks, for what I've been seeing, closely contested election in which Rahul Gandhi, heading a coalition of opposing parties, has a good shot at winning. So Modi has to show how tough he is. He can't back down against this Pakistani assault. So he's been threatening an Indian response, which again puts us back in that situation potentially that we were in 2001. India's army is about twice the size of Pakistan's army. India's overall military is about twice the size of Pakistan's military, far more tanks, delivery vehicles, and spending. But the problem is, on top of that, we figure that Pakistan probably has 150 nuclear weapons. India has approximately 140 nuclear weapons. So the danger of war between those two countries is something that has happened before and could happen again. Inside India, people are aroused, to put it mildly. Modi's Nationalist Party has been encouraging people to come out in the streets. And they're coming out in the streets with rallies which are holding signs, "Attack Pakistan, crush it." So the Indian nationalists are out calling for blood. The Indian government is taking various other measures, cutting off water to the parts of Kashmir that where the terrorists seem to have their strongholds, cutting off bus service, and doing what they can to punish the Kashmiris. And also inside of India, the High Court in India ruled that the attempts to punish Kashmiri students in India and other Kashmiris in India must stop. So they've got a volatile, explosive situation. And what does a war between India and Pakistan mean? The scientists who have been working on nuclear winter came out with recent studies that show that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, could create partial nuclear winter, the incineration of cities, sending so much smoke and soot and debris into the atmosphere that it would block the sun's rays, cause the temperatures on the earth to plummet, destroy agriculture in many parts of the world for a long period of time, and lead to between 1 and 2 billion deaths. A limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which would 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. We know that even the weapons that India and Pakistan have are bigger than that. And there's the possibility of 300 nuclear weapons being used. So the consequences will be devastating not only in India and Pakistan, but also devastating globally. Now, on the more optimistic side, or positive side, is that Imran Khan, the new Prime Minister of Pakistan, seems to have been sincerely reaching out to India, not only now, but over the past year, to try to improve relations. But we know about the situation there is that even though he's close to the army, he doesn't really have the ultimate control. In Pakistan, the military and the ISI, the intelligence services, have much more power than the Prime Minister does. So I think that Khan has been a positive force, and I'm hopeful that if Rahul Gandhi wins in the upcoming election in India, that there might be a basis for finally, after all these decades, 7 decades, moving toward resolving some of these crisis, conflict. But right now the situation is very, very dangerous. And The United States has not been paying much attention. Other countries are paying more attention. The Saudi Crown Prince was just in India. Pakistan is closely aligned with China. India and China have their own tensions. So this could spiral even out of control, even more than just between India and Pakistan, if something does begin there. And it looks like very likely that the Indians are going to retaliate. We don't know how they're going to retaliate, where they're going to retaliate. They've already been taking a lot of steps, and hopefully it doesn't go beyond that.
What is the United States' role in all of this? The Trump administration seems to be taking India's side, maybe because of their anti-Muslim prejudices in the United States. What do we think is going to happen there?
Well, the United States has long been calling on Pakistan to crack down on the terrorists that operate in Pakistan. We've seen them, the effects of their policies in terms of Afghanistan, where a lot of the Afghan insurgents are linked to Pakistani intelligence and go back and forth from Pakistan into Afghanistan. So the U.S. has tried to put pressure. The danger of putting too much pressure on the Pakistani government is that there are a lot of terrorists within Pakistan. Pakistan has 150 or somewhere between 140 and 150 nuclear weapons. The fear is what happens if those nuclear weapons fall into the hands of the extremists inside Pakistan. There have been a lot of steps taken, but the U.S. relationship to Pakistan has not been good. China has improved relations. China has been giving a lot of economic aid to Pakistan of late. And India has been moving closer to the United States. We talk about the U.S.-Indian alliances in terms of military exercises and drills that have been going on. India, for a long time, had maintained neutrality. During the Cold War, Nehru was really the leader of the Third World neutralist bloc, which John Foster Dulles and others deplored. And Nehru often was the leading critic of atmospheric testing, of the nuclear arms race, calling for nuclear disarmament globally, nuclear abolition. And India played a positive role in terms of mobilizing the Third World against the two superpowers and blocs in the Cold War. But lately, India has been moving closer toward the United States, not in a way that necessarily precludes its dealing with Russia and other countries. So the United States has been critical of Pakistan and has been calling for Pakistan to crack down on the terrorist cells that still operate pretty freely inside of Pakistan.
How about Russia?
Russia has got its own concerns right now, and this past week, Vladimir Putin gave his address to the Duma, the State of the Nation address to the Duma, which most of it was devoted to economic development, infrastructure, improving services, improving education, garbage collection, the things that the Russian people wanted to hear. But he said that we can have both guns and butter, and so he devoted a certain portion of the speech to his criticism of the United States. The big issue lately has been Trump's announcement that the U.S. giving 6 months' notice about withdrawing from the INF Treaty. This is a very dangerous and destabilizing move on the part of the United States. The INF Treaty is one of the two remaining treaties that are standing between the world now and a new nuclear arms race. So the INF Treaty was negotiated back in 1987 between Reagan and Gorbachev. After they failed to abolish nuclear weapons the previous year at Reykjavik, they came back and at least decided they could eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, which they did in the INF Treaty. And that eased tensions at a time when relations were certainly improving in the late 1980s. What that did was it got rid of the intermediate-range missiles that were in Europe, the Russian Soviet SS-20s and the U.S. Pershing missiles and other missiles that we put in Europe in response. The danger is now, as the danger was then, that these missiles are so close to Europe and to inside Europe and so close to Moscow that the Russians feared that they would only have 10 to 12 minutes to respond if they got word of a launch. Often there are false alerts about these kinds of launches. And if you've only got 10 to 12 minutes to respond before you're afraid you're going to get hit, then terrible things can happen. The intercontinental ballistic missiles at least give about 30 minutes of warning time. And so Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to abolish this class of weapons. They only, unfortunately, abolished ground-launched missiles. They still retained the sea-launched missiles and the air-launched missiles. So the United States had a huge advantage at that point, but Russia has since rebuilt its capabilities in terms of air-launched and sea-launched missiles. So even with the INF Treaty, the danger still is quite high. But it's gotten worse because now Trump says he wants the U.S. to withdraw. This is something that Bolton has been calling for years. You have to realize that people like Bolton and increasingly Pompeo and others don't like any of these international treaties that put constraints upon the United States. What they want is they prefer an unfettered arms race. And Trump, of course, would go for something like that. And he said, well, if we have an arms race, then bring it on. He says, we're going to show we can outspend the Soviets, outspend the Russians and anybody else, and we're much stronger, and we're going to win an arms race. Sort of like the Reagan strategy in the early 1980s in some ways. But what it creates is a very dangerous situation. So if the INF Treaty goes, first of all, what Putin threatened in his speech this week was that there's going to be an equivalent response on Russia's part to anything the United States does. If the U.S. puts these missiles in Europe, then Russia is going to deploy missiles at the same distance from the United States in submarines, other kinds of sea-launched ballistic missiles that Russia has. What Putin said in his March 1st, 2018 State of the Nation address, which he reiterated in this speech this past week, is that Russia has developed 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense, something we warned about all along, that the missile defense that the United States has spent so much money on and places so much faith in can be easily circumvented or defeated initially with lots and lots of decoys and with more missiles, and now with new nuclear weapons that have the capability of defeating the missile defense systems. Then the other thing that's worrisome to us is that in 2 years, in February of 2021, the New START Treaty also comes up for renewal or ends at that point. Putin has indicated that the Russians want to maintain the New START Treaty and to extend it. Mm-hmm. Trump's response was that the United States does not want to extend the New START Treaty. Again, very, very dangerous situation. So what we're looking at in 2 years is getting back to a 1980s style Cold War nuclear arms race. At that point, there were close to 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. I remember that when I take my students every summer to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I used to continually, every year, write down one statistic at the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima. And it said that by 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. The species was insane at that point. How many times over do we have to have the capability to wipe out life on this planet before we're satisfied? And that's what Trump and Bolton and others envision as increasing America's security or increasing America's domination, America's hegemony. Well, they have to wake up because the era of American unipolarity is over. It was back in 1990 when Charles Krauthammer, the neocon leading thinker at that point, said that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've entered the period of unipolarity. And he said that this is the unipolar moment, is what he called it. And he said it could last for 30 or 40 years with nobody being able to threaten or challenge the United States. And then in 2003, after the invasion of Afghanistan seemed to be going well in the beginning, Krauthammer announced that it's no longer the unipolar moment, now it's the unipolar era. It's going to last indefinitely into the future. Well, things didn't go so well after we invaded Iraq, and things went bad in Afghanistan. And so by 2005, even Krauthammer said, well, I was over-optimistic. The unipolar era is over, and we don't know how long the unipolar moment is going to last. Well, it didn't last. Now Russia has rebuilt its military, and China has challenged us economically, and India will soon have a bigger population than China. So American unipolarity, American hegemony, the era of the Pax Americana is over already. And we're being challenged in these ways. But Trump, given his view of the world, thinks that we can spend ourselves back into unipolarity. It doesn't work that way. And so the conflicts that he's been exacerbating between China, the U.S. and China, and the U.S. and Russia, the interesting thing, so Trump is always attacked as being Putin's puppet or Putin's poodle, and that Putin is pulling the strings. Well, if we look at it objectively, relations between the U.S. and Russia are worse now than they've been certainly since the 1980s and arguably since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. It's partly why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock in January 2018 back to 2 minutes before midnight. They had done that in 1953 after Russia tested what we thought at the time was their hydrogen bomb. Then they moved it to 2 minutes before midnight. And then gradually things got a little bit more sane and they moved the clock back. But now so many situations are really dangerous that could spin out of control.
President Trump has been very vocal on nuclear weapons in particular, and bragging over his increase in the defense budget to over $700 and change $billion. Do you think that he and the president, the leader of North Korea, should get the Nobel Peace Prize for their work?
Well, you know that Trump asked Abe to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, and Abe dutifully did so. You would think that this is a comedy routine, the thought that Trump would win the Nobel Peace Prize, but we've had a few other comical winners in the past. We had Teddy Roosevelt. We had Henry Kissinger. You know, when Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize, he and his counter-Vietnamese negotiator won it together at that point. But at least the Vietnamese had the integrity to turn it down because the war hadn't even ended at that point. But Kissinger accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. The great political satirist Tom Lehrer said at the time that he gave up performing. And he said political satire became obsolete when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, I think political satire has again become obsolete when Donald Trump has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. That doesn't mean that negotiations with Korea aren't important. The reason why we've gotten to this point is because Moon Jae-in, the South Korean leader, took the initiative and refused to go along with Trump's insistence that he back down from approaching the North Koreans. This is Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in was brought to power by the Candlelight Revolution that took place there. It was a very popular uprising, and the South Korean people were fed up, not just with Park Geun-hye's rule, but the increasing belligerence. And people were very frightened. Remember back to late 2017, after Trump started, certainly North Korea was not blameless in what was going on. They had just tested a nuclear bomb that they said was a hydrogen bomb that had, we estimate, maybe 140 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. And then they tested intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the continental United States. So North Korea was being very, very provocative in its own way. And then Trump, of course, takes the situation and exacerbates it. We were very close to war, or at least it seemed that way in late 2017. Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that he thought there was a 50-50 chance that we were going to go to war in North Korea, with North Korea. And that would have been horrifying. Even if they didn't use nuclear weapons, they had so much conventional artillery on the border, 35 miles from Seoul, a city of 25 million, it would have been nightmarish. Fortunately, after Trump exacerbates the situation and brings it up to the verge of warfare, then he backed down and started to become much more sane about relations with North Korea, to the point now where he says he and Kim Jong-un have been sending each other love letters. It's great that they're meeting again in Hanoi. The U.S. media is already saying it's a failure, even before the meeting takes place. They're warning that Trump's going to give away the store there. The intelligence community is making similar kinds of warnings. Well, that's not what I'm concerned about. I think that the situation we have now is so much better, so much healthier than what it was a year ago, that even though everybody's making fun of Trump, that he got nothing from it, what we have now is that North Korea has stopped testing missiles, has stopped testing bombs. The United States has stopped the provocative war games that it was conducting. They've been talking, exchanging ideas that diplomacy has replaced threatening belligerence and warfare. So the bellicose rhetoric has stopped, and now we have to figure out how we can begin to move slowly, beginning to build up trust between our two sides. There are things the United States can do. There are things that North Korea can do. The United States can allow the joint economic enterprises between North Korea and South Korea that have been blocked by UN sanctions, and that the United States has not allowed the South Koreans to continue doing, the railroad lines and other things like that. We can reopen the industrial park, the Kaesong Industrial Park. So a lot of things that can be done. The United States can also begin easing sanctions. That's a big issue for North Korea. North Korea says so long as the U.S. maintains these sanctions, then there's a hostile relationship, and they're not going to begin to move. North Korea can put a freeze on its fissile materials. There are other measures that North Korea can take. We can start moving incrementally. When the U.S. was saying, well, they promised complete denuclearization, that's not true. They never did that. And not unilateral denuclearization. What we need, we've got a vast amount of U.S. troops in South Korea. We can begin lessening the U.S. troops, easing the sanctions, stop the threats, and crucial to the North Koreans is a peace treaty from the Korean War that was fought between 1950 and 1953. That war did not end with a peace treaty. What it ended was an armistice. So we're still technically at war all these decades later. First, we can at least make a declaration of peace and then move to a formal treaty. That would go a big way to assuaging many of the North Koreans' fears.
Peter Kuznick, how would you in a minute sum up the situation, and how should citizens of the world confront the way the world is going the way it is today?
What we're facing now is that all 9 nuclear nations are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. Led by the United States, by Barack Obama, the United States announced then it was going to be a $1 trillion nuclear modernization over 30 years. The estimate now is that it's going to be at least a $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization. I can think of a lot of better things that money could be used for, but it's going to be to make America's nuclear arsenal more efficient and more usable, which is insanity. But the world is insane right now in terms of creating destructive capabilities. We waste so much of our resources on perfecting our means of killing rather than our means of keeping people alive in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. So I think we need to change our priorities. And it's not going to happen if we depend on the leaders themselves to take that initiative. The people have got to become educated, knowledgeable, and put pressure on their elected officials. We need to be seeing rallies. Back in 1982, there were 1 million people demonstrating in New York Central Park for cutting back on the nuclear arms race. Barack Obama was even out there, but we've got to begin mobilizing again, taking this into the hands of the people, not only here, but all over the world. What we need is some kind of international leadership. Right now, there are no statesmen in the world. What you got is a series of pygmies in all these different countries. Donald Trump might be the most egregious example of somebody who's got no vision and is exacerbating, blowing up situations, ripping up the Iran nuclear deal, creating worse relations with Russia now. But he's got a lot of company right now among these narrow-minded, short-sighted nationalists who are running every major country. So what we need, though, is for the leaders of the world to sit down and begin to figure out ways that we can ease tensions, work together to solve some of these crises, to solve some of the problems, to create a much more democratic and a much safer, more peaceful world. It can be done. You know, as Jack Kennedy said, we created all of these situations so we can uncreate them. It's in our hands, but the United States has not had a real leader since Kennedy, the last year of his presidency. Maybe early Carter, you could say, and maybe sometimes Obama, at least in his speeches, was thinking in these kinds of terms. But in reality, we've had leaders in most of the major countries who have been pushing very narrow nationalist agendas that are making the world more dangerous. The fact that we can't move together on to deal with climate change is crazy. So we need international leadership. The people have got to mobilize to put pressure on their leaders to begin to do the right thing, not to play on the biases and the prejudices and these parochial tendencies, but to begin to think in terms of the human species, begin to think in terms of the future of the planet. And that's what the world's people should demand of their leaders. But so far, I'm not seeing very much that's really encouraging, unfortunately.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
American University history professor Peter Kuznick, who heads the school's Nuclear Studies Institute. You've been listening to The Torch on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo.